Channel is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I'm Mike Mateen.
and we are continuing our 2022 Oscar movie marathon with, continuing to update our progress as we make our way towards this Sunday's award ceremony. So first, we'll just kind of quick update on what we've seen since the last update, and then we'll start digging deep into the movies that we have now both seen, which we've got a couple of good ones, I think. So to begin with, which movies did you see since the last update?
So, since the last update, I kind of took your advice, because remember I asked you, hey, if I had to focus on some best pictures, what would you
Mm-hmm.
recommend? And, you gave me different cases for all of them as opposed to like, you should just see these ones, right?
Yeah.
So, kind of took that information and decided to make it a focus to ensure I saw Belfast, CODA, King Richard, and West Side Story, if nothing else, right? And so I have not seen King Richard yet, but I did see the other three Best Picture nominees.
Great. So since we've now both seen all of those, we will discuss them more in depth. Um, because I had, you know, uh, accelerated hard and seen all of the Best Picture nominees as of the last update, I slowed down a little bit, but I still saw a couple of the other nominated movies. I just actually today, just 10 minutes ago, finished watching The Lost Daughter, which was nominated for Best Actress Olivia Colman, Best Supporting Actress for Jessie Buckley, and then I believe Best Adapted Screenplay. Ah, yes, from Maggie Gyllenhaal. And so it is the story. I actually pretty much nailed the premise of it when I described my impression of it from the trailer, which is essentially that we have a woman played by Olivia Colman on vacation who ends up kind of getting involved, perhaps more than she should, with another young family that arrives at the same vacation place. However, what I didn't realize is that it's not just like a, you know, like a silly human drama or anything. There's a little bit more sinister to it. Implications of danger, for example. But overall, it's still kind of just a psychological drama. A big part of what gets her involved with this other family is that she's seeing things that remind her of her own youth and raising her own daughters. And so seeing this young woman with her daughter makes her think and flash back to her own youth. And so a lot of the movie is actually cutting back and forth to Olivia Colman and then also the younger version of her. Which actually, you know what? I want to just double check right now because it occurred to me that I'm not 100% sure if Jessie Buckley was this other young mother or if she was young version of Olivia Colman's character. Let me just double check that really quick. I think she must be young, the young version of Lita, who Olivia Colman plays. Ah, yes, sure enough, that's definitely who it is. So, oddly enough, it kind of funny in that respect is that the two acting nominations from this movie are literally both playing the same character at different points in that character's life. But in any case, it's pretty good. It left me with a lot to think about. The ending's a little bit mysterious, but overall, I think it's pretty good. I think it's definitely worth checking out if you're into human dramas at all. Like it's a good one, I think.
Nice.
Uh, I also saw. Shoot, what was the? Oh, I watched The Worst Person in the World, which was nominated for two things. One was the best foreign film from Norway, but also for best original screenplay for that movie. And it is in Norwegian, I guess would be the language, I guess. And it's about this woman who's basically we're introduced to her as she, from some perspectives, squanders her potential, because we like our very first opening montage introduction to her is that she's doing great in medical school until she suddenly decides she wants to switch her major to psychology. And then she's doing okay in psychology until she decides she wants to be a photographer. And then she's studying photography but can't make her ends meet, so now she's working in a bookstore, and now she is mostly working in a bookstore. And that is the introductory montage of this character. And so there's this implication that, like, even if nobody says so, there's this expectation that, like, oh, she was great, she had so much potential, and now look at her, right? But it is mostly about her trying to figure out what she wants to do with her life and her relationships with a couple of different people, and it's pretty good. Like, it's again, it's another nicely complex story about this woman. And one of the things that's notable about it is that the movie has a couple of sort of fantasy sequences that are really interesting and fun. And I think overall, it's another good story. And then.
I said excellent.
Oh, okay, yeah. And then so the last movie that I saw from the list is Free Guy, which is nominated for Best Visual Effects. This is the Ryan Reynolds. He is a video game NPC movie where we have a video game that is largely like, say, Grand Theft Auto online or whatever, where you have the players doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and then it's a city where there's people walking around, and he is one of those NPCs. But what becomes clear early on is that, like, it's a whole complicated plot, but essentially he becomes self-aware and starts deciding he doesn't want to just keep doing his NPC routine anymore. It's very silly. It's a perfectly fine and entertaining one of those, if you follow me.
Yes. Well, and I always thought, without having seen it, I just love. I think Ryan Reynolds is like perfectly cast for this movie. Just, and it's nothing against him by any means. It's not about. It's just that he has that look of like what you think a living NPC in a video game like that would look like. You know, just sort of that classic. You know, he's very classic looking, I guess, is the best way, in the way that they would design a kind of a good looking white dude.
So it's funny because he basically knows his name as Guy, but officially his name is Blue Shirt Guy because he's just an NPC template. And he wears a blue shirt. But yeah, it's like, I mean, if you saw the trailer, for anyone, if you saw the trailer and said, "Oh, that looks fun," it's basically exactly what you think. I think there's a couple of places where you see some Frankenstein stitches where you get the feeling like, yeah, I think that this particular version of the plot came together in editing, and that there was maybe some other things happening that didn't make the cut or something, because there's some abrupt transitions and so on. But overall, I think it's perfectly entertaining, and it's just, like I said when I called it one of those. It's, it's kind of just sort of a, fun, silly, high concept action comedy, and that's what it is, and it does that just fine. Okay, so with those out of the way, do you have one of these other three movies that we want to, these three Best Picture nominees? We've got Belfast, CODA, and West Side Story. Do you have any particular order you want to jump into those with? I mean, we might as well do alphabetical then, I suppose.
All right.
So, Belfast. Yes. So I had already talked about it, describing it, just briefly. If people don't remember, it's the story of a kid growing up during the period known as the Troubles, which, and it should get better. And yeah, there we go. Now, it shouldn't happen again. I'm not sure why it does that in the first place, but it does just kind of do that for a little while once it's been running for a little while, and then it stops. But it's fine now, so here we go. So, and that's the basic premise of the movie: is it's this kid who's simultaneously sort of seeing this conflict unfold around him, but also trying to be a kid and do kid stuff. And so that's what did you think of it?
I really liked it. Um, I, it was, you did describe it accurately in that, it's, while the trouble in Northern Ireland exists, and it's obviously part of what is the thread of the movie. That isn't the focus of the movie. The focus of the movie is on the family and the kid. And I, obviously I understood what you meant in concept. I get, and the movie delivered on that. But that's what makes it such a good movie is it, if you didn't know much about this time, it gives you enough context for you to understand. If you just want to watch movies about that, there's other movies that cover that, right? Like about why it's happening, why it's difficult. But the texture is there enough that you feel the tension and you feel the trouble and you feel the Protestant Catholic part, and it makes sure to really acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
But what it's really about is how do families who don't really have anything to do with it, how were they affected, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I left this movie because, I mean, this, but not everybody here would know this, that, my family is from Cuba. My father left when he was 13, right after Castro had taken over. This is, I mean, it's not obviously exactly the story because it's a different thing, but it reminded me of stories that he's told, right? And it gave me context visually to what he probably was feeling as this child whose, family wanted to leave Cuba. He just was a kid. He understood things were weird. He didn't know what was going on. Like, to hear his memories of like the Cuban Revolution is odd. And I think we might have talked about it in The Godfather too, when they were in Cuba and there's the scene and the revolution happens there and they're knocking down the parking meters.
Mm-hmm.
That was like a big deal to my dad. Like, that's his biggest memory. So it was interesting to him that that's also what carried over into the movie. Like, it was such a thing because he remembered his family complaining and everybody complaining when the parking meters went in about how, Batista just wanted to rip everybody off who wanted to park in the city and blah, blah, blah. And it was like a thing that people complained about. And then he was watching on TV and people are smashing these things that everybody was complaining about. And like, that's his memory, right? And he was there for the Bay of Pigs. And like, he has weird memories of that too, because he didn't really understand what was happening then. But like, he had neighbors on the roof with AKs, like shooting into the sky, like they were going to conquer the Americans, like just weird stuff that he didn't understand. Then he didn't understand like why they had to leave and like why they're moving to Florida and they're never coming back. And there's strange things that happen there because like the government knew they were leaving, even though technically they were only on visas, and they come in and they started inventorying their house because the government was going to take it over and like started tagging things and all that. And it's just like, he has these, and all the time he just wants to play with his cousins and do kid stuff. Right. And so this movie really, for me personally, like, I've heard those stories my whole life. And now I got to watch a very well told version that really makes you feel what that kid feels. Like you're very empathetic towards that whole family and how it happens. Right. And you understand that. I mean, I think it's a really powerful part at the end, which I guess, the spoilers,
Sure.
Obviously it happens. Nothing we've tried is a spoiler yet. That happened in Ireland.
Yeah.
Like,
sure.
But ultimately what, just quick context, the father has to keep going over to England to get work. And so he's traveling back and forth, and there's a lot of issues with that because he has to keep coming back and forth through essentially a war zone, right? And so sometimes he has trouble coming back in because they're worried that because he's coming from England, he's a spy or whatever. Like, there's all sorts of stuff with that. But ultimately, in order for him, he gets a promotion offer. It gets them out of that travel. It gets everybody. If he moves his family over to England, and leaves the only home that they've all ever known.
Right.
And ultimately he decides to do that. And, we could talk more about the context of the grandparent story, but the grandmother at the end is, decides to stay, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yet encourages them to leave. I think the last line she has, Judi Dench plays her, and,
Right.
she hugs them and says, and they're kind of like in this awkward stance, and she's like, look, just go, but she means it in like, do what's right for you, but I can't leave Belfast. Like
Mm-hmm.
I would rather endure this than leave the only place I've ever known. And I have other family members that didn't leave Cuba because of that, and so it, I don't know, it was really, really well done,
Mm.
and really struck that message. And I read an article in the Guardian paper that was making the case for why Belfast should be the best picture. And it actually highlighted a lot of that, is that because of what it does,
Mm-hmm.
you can lift this to really understand any family in a conflict area who's not directly involved in the conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
But who is affected by it. Like it doesn't make it so unique to Belfast. And that's one of the magics of this film.
So one thing that I'll kind of raise that kind of ties into that is this is not some so take this with a grain of salt, because mostly what I'm doing is I am reporting what someone else saw as a criticism of it. It's not something that I felt strongly about, but it ties into just what you were saying, which is to say that in some ways the movie's playing it safe by telling the story of a family who wasn't involved, right? And in particular, like the grandparents' generation are just like the rest of the family in saying, "Oh, I wish this all wasn't happening." It's a bunch of, and it kind of implying that it's like it's the younger generation that was driving it, but some people who, at least according to this article, who actually lived through that time period, were saying that no, they like that generation was stoking it more than anything. And so, in some respects, it's not to say that there weren't families who weren't involved, like this one, but that in some ways the movie's playing it safe by choosing to depict a family that's not really on one side or the other, and not really having anyone in the family be choosing a side. Which I can say, like, I mean, I think that's a fair observation about the movie.
I agree. Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily make it like bad, right? It's just that's one of those criticisms that's a little bit like you made a different movie than the one that I wish you made, as opposed to this movie has anything specifically wrong with it, right? But I
Yes.
thought it was an
And that's
interesting note about it.
I agree. I think that is an interesting note. I think it's an accurate observation in the fact that it does choose to do that. It does
Mm-hmm.
choose not to take a side. But my argument would be, like, if you want to watch a movie about one side or the other, those movies exist already, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not a thing that hasn't been made into a movie. What makes this movie unique and interesting is the fact that it doesn't pick a side, and it's not about that. And it becomes more evergreen to conflicts in general. And I think that, as I said, that's what I kind of the part I just went through.
Mm-hmm.
If this movie was about whether you were on one side or the other, it makes it too unique to the situation in Belfast, right? Because then it has to
Yeah,
explain
yeah.
why they're on this side, why they're on that side, you know. And the reality is, yeah, yes, there's not a lot of people that are just not at least leaning one way or the other. Like, I can't even
Mm-hmm.
tell you that. Like, my family, they didn't, they didn't like communism. Like, it's not like they left because they were just the troubles were of Cuba were bothering them and they were
Mm-hmm.
inconvenienced. Like, they didn't want to live in communist Cuba. Like, so they did have a side, even if they weren't activists.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably true if this family was real, but this isn't meant to be that, like
Right.
that. And
Well,
so,
to be sure, this family, they are they were Protestants, if I remember right.
yes, and because they were,
Yeah.
remember, there's some times where the kids like
Yeah.
trying to understand the
Yeah.
Catholics.
So in particular, although they are not particularly, on either side, it's also nonetheless they would only be welcome on one side, right? Like if they did not have their choice of which side.
Right.
It's more like the one side is not only welcoming, but actually rather insisting that they help and support that side. And so they almost have more, goodness, they almost have more trouble with the people who are ostensibly on their side, because those are the people who are saying, no, you have to help us, you have to support all of this. And so they almost have like, that's the person that they really end up in conflict with, rather than the other side, which again, you could almost even make that, again, it's like, well, the movie is kind of very carefully trying to be as uncontroversial as you can be when depicting a very controversial time period. And so, but again, like, I don't think that's bad. I think one of the movies that it reminded me of is actually, oh gosh, what's the name of it? The one that was just from a couple of years ago with Taika Waititi and the kid in Nazi Germany. It was, I want to like say JoJo, but that's like a cartoon, I think.
No, it is something like that. Jojo Rabbit.
Jojo Rabbit, that's it.
It
There's
has
a
like it
there's a
sounds like a
cartoon
cartoon.
called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and that I knew that wasn't it, but Jojo Rabbit, yeah. So like it made me think of that in tone. Although I would say Belfast never gets as heavy as Jojo Rabbit does, but a lot of Jojo Rabbit is this kind of silliness of the kid trying to be a kid with the backdrop of all of this other stuff, right?
Right.
Like that is similar, but that's an example of one where, I mean, I think it's less controversial to say that the movie's on one side and not the other, as opposed to trying to ride the middle. But in Belfast, it is sort of trying to be, you know, both sides are causing problems, and there's a lot of people in the middle who wish the problems would just stop, as opposed to one side or the other. But yeah, I think the movie's pretty sweet. It's got some good performances. So let's see, like what it's nominated for. It's Best Picture, Best Director for Kenneth Branagh, and then a Best Supporting Actor for Ciarán Hinds, who played the grandfather, and then Supporting Actress for Judi Dench, playing the grandmother, as you mentioned. Best Original Screenplay, Kenneth Branagh, and I think Best Original Song for Down to Joy, which I believe played over the ending credits. And then there's one more, I want to say Best Sound. Yeah. So that's seven total nominations for Belfast.
And I think every one of those nominations is an accurate one. I think it's on a 10 Best Picture slate. I think it's one of the 10 best, most impactful movies of the year. I think it won Best Screenplay at the Golden Globes.
You know what? I really haven't been keeping up on some of those other awards, so I'm not sure. But
Didn't watch it, but I thought I remember just in like kind of looking at stuff about it that it did. And that's, let's see. It won Best Motion Picture or Best Screenplay Drama, and it in the British Academy Film Awards it won Outstanding British Film. So those are some things that it has already won. And I think I feel like that's an appropriate win. I think if you were going to say like what's the best part about this movie, like the script and what deliver with the foundation that delivers that what we've all the things that we've talked about is that, and then also the acting of the grandparents, which really give us, you know, the parents they're not blank. That's not the right way to say it, but there's less. You get more. The kid has more interactions that are like educational and transformational through his grandparents.
yeah,
Yeah.
the parents are very wrapped up in. They each have their thing, and they're each very wrapped up in that. So the father is having the conflict of really kind of feeling like, I don't want to keep having to do this travel, and I think that it's getting increasingly dangerous here. And he's the one that's been going over there, so of course it seems like an easier thing for him. But then the mother is much more resistant to the idea. Like she obviously is concerned about the escalating violence outside, but at the same time, she has never lived anywhere else. This is home. She's worried that, like, if we leave, are we just going to become second class citizens over there where we won't even know anybody and all of that sort of thing. And, I mean,
People
those are
won't be able to,
reasonable concerns.
yeah, people won't be able to, our kids won't have friends because they'll have weird accents. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like all things that are legitimate concerns when you move to another country,
Yeah.
and, but I think the point there, and that gave me time to kind of think what I didn't mean was blank is that because they are good performances, but they are plot advancement performances
Yeah.
more than emotional performances, and it's designed that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're designed to take these positions that move us through the plot, and the grandparents are designed to give the the sort of the more emotional weight,
Yeah.
the empathy with the child, understanding, and it's almost why, like, okay, that's part of why maybe he cheats a little bit and takes that generation out of the conflict, is so that these grandparents can be more pure
Right.
role models, right? And so it could be a distinct choice that he did that, not necessarily playing it
Mm-hmm.
safe, but saying these grandparents are meant to tell this story, so we're going to remove them from this particular part of it because it doesn't change the history. Like I'm not teaching history here,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm not,
Well, and we could also imagine that because the movie is really told from the perspective of the kid, we could imagine that there might have been some politics from his family that they just kept from him,
yeah,
right?
you could make that case that this is his interpretation of it, and that this is how he remembers it, right? Or
Right.
whatever, yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's very sweet in that regard. I think it deals with all of those real world conflicts with a light touch, but well in that regard. Like it makes the choice to not engage too deeply with the real, complications of that time period beyond just the idea that it's happening in a real way, but handles that well, I think. And yeah, I it didn't resonate with me quite as personally as it sounded like it did for you, but I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to comment on that I thought was really interesting. This was a directorial choice and also a script choice, but the opening of the movie is interesting. But I really liked the headspace it puts you into. Okay, so the movie opens with some very beautifully shot in color. The movie is mostly in black and white. Actually, it is in black and white, other than like there's some things with like to make the kids' memory
Yeah, I
like
was
feel
actually
about this
gonna
movie.
tie. I was gonna come back to that in a moment, but go ahead.
Yeah, so it opens with in color modern day Belfast, beautifully shot scenes of the city, really interesting landmarks, and and also showing that it's a shipping town with some cool dock shots, and you kind of are like, okay, whatever, this is Kenneth Branagh's hometown, like this is a love letter to Belfast in a sort of a secondary way. But really what it does for the movie is it reminds you that something that so many of us are only familiar with through this conflict and through the IRA and what they did in England and the bombings and all of this stuff, like it reminds you this is a real place, and that it gives more weight to the people who want to stay. Like, not that they want to stay and see these pretty things, but it's like
Mm-hmm.
it is a good city. It's a pretty city. It's a city like any other city. Like, just because we don't have that perception of it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that they're wrong to love it. And in 2 minutes, it actually puts you in that space. And I thought it was really cool, in such a subtle way, right?
Mm-hmm. So I was going to bring up the fact that it's mostly in black and white, but with somewhat a bit like Schindler's List did. Although again, this movie, no one should expect this movie to be like Schindler's List. It's just not doing that. It's not nearly so heavy, but in a similar cinematic technique, it will occasionally take certain elements and make those in color while everything around it is black and white. So like, for example, there's a point where they go to, like, it's a Christmas Carol or something, right? It's a,
Yeah.
yeah, so they go to see it as a play, and there's these reverse shot of the kid watching the play, and so we cut to him in the audience in black and white, and then to the stage, which is in color, to kind of, I think, illustrate that it's like, you know, growing in his imagination, right?
Right. It's
But
like
then
a
also,
vivid memory.
yeah,
Yeah.
but then it'll also occasionally do shots where, like the reverse shot where we're seeing in his grandmother's glasses, is the reflection is also in color. I'm not sure if I like that as much. That felt a little bit distracting to me. I liked it, that like the idea of the play in color, but having it be just in the glasses seemed strange to me,
Yep.
because that's not, the kid's perspective anymore. So, but it's like, that's not a big deal. But I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of my feelings on it. I reflected on it when it was done, not in the same way as like the Power of the Dog. I If I was ranking, I would say of the movies that we've talked about so far, which would be Don't Look Up, Nightmare Alley, Power of the Dog, this is my favorite.
Okay.
It will not be my favorite as we continue to talk.
Okay.
It is above the ones I had seen. So I watched, and I
Sure.
actually saw this one. Um, Actually, no, I saw CODA first. Never mind.
Okay.
And so, which we'll talk about next, which I really loved, and you had a great recommendation for. But I was already kind of sold on like, CODA is probably going to be my favorite. And then I saw this, and I kind of had to pause. I was like, this was really good. This was better than I expected. Not that I expected it to be very good, and it still over delivered on expectations. So that's kind of where I left it. So I was very happy that as part of what, the reason why we do this, like,
Yeah.
I don't know that I would have sought it out. I don't know when it would have fit into where I would have watched it, since I don't watch a ton of movies anymore. And I'm glad I took the time to watch this. That's fine.
I mean,
And
that's great. That's kind of like, just like you said, that's kind of the whole thing of what we're doing here, is that we discover and enjoy movies we probably wouldn't have ever watched otherwise.
yeah, and I'm talking to my family after whenever we're done, and I'm going to recommend this to them, because I would be interested to hear my father's take as to whether it feels it does the same thing that it does for me about his life story. So yeah, and we can update on a later cast.
Yeah. Well, so we'll probably
Maybe
do
it'll
one
be
more to sum up like what were the winners of each category and that sort of thing. But in the meantime, shall we move on to CODA then?
Mhm.
Okay. So as just to recap, the brief summary for anyone who doesn't remember or didn't see our previous episodes, CODA is an acronym that stands for Child of Deaf Adults. It's about a girl who is the only hearing member of her family, and her family tends to be like very reliant on her, not just because they're deaf, but because they have a small fishing boat business that they rely on her as one of the family members who helps with the business. But she discovers a talent and aptitude and a desire for singing, and she finds herself struggling to balance those priorities. That's the basic idea. And I had said that it was my favorite of the 10 Best Picture nominees. But so what did you think?
So of the 7 that I've seen, it is also my favorite. It was a great recommendation. I think I even texted you. You obviously didn't want to talk too much because we would talk here. It I expected, even after hearing all just you described it, I knew the premise. It felt like it was going to be, because again, it's an Academy Award Best Picture about deaf adults. Like, that feels like this is just going to be super soupy drama, that you kind of have to wade through. And
I
it is not that.
I was definitely I was participating in a Discord conversation about this movie too, and just some other film discussion where it was just talked about how like the premise almost sounds like it would be a Lifetime movie or something like that. Like a, probably not Hallmark, but Lifetime is like that's the niche. It sounds like it would be kind of a sort of more hacky, maybe even slightly exploitative type of premise. But
And that's why I use the term like soupy. Like you almost have to
mm,
like wade through it, right? Like you're just gonna have to kind of get through
mhm,
the overly dramatic and overly, oh my God, it's just, and it does not do that at all. It is I don't want to say super lighthearted because it does have a really, really genuine core, and there are tough conversations and tough things
mhm,
that happen in this movie. But it gets you there by having endearing characters that are funny,
mhm,
likable. You find yourself kind of riding the situation, and then when you get to the heavier moments, they're more and they're more grounded in reality.
mhm.
And you recognize that this isn't just going to hit you over the head with all this stuff. Like it definitely takes you for a fun ride, but but it also doesn't it's not like a knee jerk thing, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's building its own credibility.
Well, so like the movie that kept coming to mind for me is that it's very sweet, right? Like it cares about its characters and it makes you want to care for them and want them to be happy, and the tension is in being afraid that there's no way for all the characters to be happy. And
Yes.
that's what we're worried about. That's the tension in the film, is that we want everybody to be happy, but we don't see how that could be because it
Right.
seems like they're in conflict in that regard. And so, but it is in that sense, it wants us, the movie likes the characters and it wants us to like the characters too. But it's about how sometimes, you can have two likable people who want different things, and it can be challenged for them to try to figure out how to both be happy in that situation. And but I think I really liked it. Like one thing that I do want to say about it is, and this is not even necessarily, again, like I can't speak this criticism for myself, but it's a reflection that this movie is, I guess, somewhat divisive in the deaf community. Like there are things that it does that the like the deaf community is not a monolith, right? Like there's lots of diverse perspectives in there, and some of them really like, for example, that it casts actual deaf actors as the mother, the father, the brother. The mother is Marlee Matlin, who of course is like she's been around in Hollywood for a while. But Troy Kotsur, who plays the father, is one of the best supporting actor nominees this year, and he's great. And the
It's
brother
awesome.
is great. Daniel Durant is, and so casting deaf actors in the deaf roles is a big step, especially now that we have like a best supporting actor nomination for a deaf actor. Um, and I think that, like to my perspective, from someone who's not deaf, it seemed to me that it was avoiding a lot of the sort of tropes and cliches of the way deaf characters are sometimes portrayed. But I guess that there are still some elements that some in the deaf community felt like they didn't like how certain things were handled. But I think that can also sometimes be a reflection of that's why you need more representation so that you don't have to have any one movie carry the whole weight of being the movie that does this, right? But so I thought it was worth bringing that up, that there are some criticisms of it from that direction, but that it also has a lot of credits in that direction for handling some of the pieces of it. So I know that for me, like I thought it. I guess I shouldn't try to comment on how well it handles deaf representation because that's not me. But so
Well, but
what
what
I
we can say is that it gave us an accessibility into understanding that community in a way that maybe a more overly handed stereotypical movie wouldn't have done. Like
mhm,
it, what I again I feel and is that it treated them not just as deaf characters but as individual characters, and
yeah,
I think that's important. And to your
mhm,
point, like if we had more representation, like they had their own personalities, and there was so much against type, not just of deaf characters, but of father characters and mother characters, and you know, people in marginalized communities in general. Like, I think for me, and again, just speaking from my interest in the movie, I thought it was fascinating that Marlee Matlin was almost like bigoted towards hearing people, right? And like there was that whole like thing, and the argument she gets in with her daughter, and I can see why that could be divisive or whatever. But like just from my perspective, I thought that was really interesting to say,
Yeah.
well, you could understand, like, because you almost are empathetic with her bigotry. Like, you
Yeah.
understand why she doesn't like that, or why she, you know, because you have mothers sometimes that only think about themselves sometimes.
Hmm.
Like that's a real thing, right? Like when she says like, why is this always about you, when her mom says, oh well, if I was blind, would you want to be a painter? And she says, why is this all about you? That's a thing that happens with regular mom, like
Oh,
not
for
like,
sure. Yeah.
terrible
Yeah.
terrible way to say it, not
Yeah. Like,
any mom, whether you're anything.
right. Like
And the idea that the people,
this type of conflict where you have the daughter who wants to pursue something that requires them to pull away some from what the rest of the family is doing. Like that's a pretty universal family story. It doesn't have anything to do with the element of deafness in the mix. It's just that's the specific story here. Uh,
and when the mom has to spend time with the hearing bitches, as she calls it, like that's a thing, that's a normal thing of like, hey, if there's people who I don't communicate well with, whether it's because of this divide or any
mhm.
other reason,
Yeah.
like that's a thing. And to her be like, well, maybe if you didn't call them that,
Yeah.
maybe you would enjoy spending their time with them.
Well, and so I think one of the things that maybe it just, from the perspective we have of, I think it is reasonable to, um, I think my normal turn of phrase would be to listen to the complaints of people who feel like there are criticisms to be made about it. I certainly don't mean that to be any kind of a pun. To
No, I think
research
that's fair
and
because I think
understand the people who are criticizing the movie from that direction, to understand what it is that they're saying about it, and try to be more aware of these issues in general, I think is a good and valuable thing that I was inspired to do from watching this movie.
correct. The fact that the movie exists and that criticism is now out there is a good thing, I
Mm-hmm.
think, because it allows us to learn more and question more, and that yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I think it's also it's just it's the same as a lot of movies are, where like you could imagine in some ways, like some of the criticisms of movies like The Green Book, right, are that it's sort of like race relations easy mode for people who don't want to be challenged too much. You know what I mean? Like that sort of some of those sorts of criticisms, right? Um, are you familiar with that discussion? I'm not. I don't want to be uh, tossing that out there if it's
cursory, yeah.
okay. Well, just in the sense of like movies that allow people to say, "Well, I would have been one of the good white people,
Oh yeah, yeah,
not one
yeah,
of the
yeah. I
bad
don't
white
think
people."
that, yeah.
Yeah, so that sort of thing, like lets people sort of imagine themselves in the shoes of the people who aren't bad, even though there's a lot of societal stuff, systematic stuff all along. And so, in some respects, I think some of the criticisms come from that direction. But I just wanted to mention that in fairness, because I think it's appropriate to understand that some of those criticisms are being made. But that said, um, the movie is just like,
But I just want to say
oh yeah, no, go
like
ahead.
one
Yeah.
last thing on that I thought was it, and I wish I'd actually like researched it, but my wife said it in the midst of the movie and like some of the more heartfelt times, so I never actually researched this. But so my cousin via my wife's side is actually a interpreter, a
Okay.
sign language interpreter. And so my wife asked the question and said, I wonder if, you know, if this movie is available where if you know sign language or you're, whether you're deaf or not, could you flip the closed captioning to where the sign language is not closed captioned and the speaking parts are closed captioned? And I just thought that was an interesting, like, I never really thought about that. Like, like, does that, like, if you don't need the closed captioning for that part of it, could you turn it off? I don't think it's actually an availability thing, but it was just like a weird perspective that she kind of just took because of our cousin. And
You know, one of the that what that makes me think actually is that one of the things that I was reading about in researching some of this was that like some of the criticisms were saying essentially that even when speaking in sign language, often the characters were it was like they were speaking translated sign language as opposed to if you just speak sign language and that's just what you speak, you would say things differently than if you are translating something that someone wrote out in English. Right? Like if it has, so it's a little bit like saying if someone wrote a screenplay in Italian and then you ran it through English Google Translate and then had that's what the actors were reading, right? It would feel a little bit strange probably, right? And so some of it was saying that, which I just found interesting just in the sense that while it makes sense, it's not necessarily obvious that even American Sign Language is not necessarily just a one-for-one translation with English.
no, and it's like any other language, and it has slang, it
Mm-hmm.
has the things that don't necessarily exactly translate, right? It has its own slang,
Yeah.
and,
So,
and I see that sometimes, like when I see, like, even though it's not the same thing, because it typically, like, just because there's more of it, like in Spanish speaking parts, they do tend to be more natural Spanish
mhm.
speaking pieces. And actually, we'll get to that a little bit in West Side Story. Um, there are things that are slang that when they do the closed captioning, like it doesn't necessarily, the closed captioning doesn't actually match what they're saying in Spanish,
Mhm.
because it's just the way that they say it. So it's almost the reverse. Like if you truly did like it doesn't translate back,
Right.
right? You know,
It makes me think of anime translations, where in the whole question of subs versus dubs and that sort of thing. But before we go too far down that tangent,
no, it's
yeah.
yeah,
So I think all of that's very important to discuss because it's obviously a big piece of the movie and it's worth like if we're going to praise a movie for its representation of a marginalized community, we ought to ask that community what they think about it, right?
yes,
So, in any case, that's why I wanted to bring that up. But just
fair enough. Yeah.
yeah, jumping back to the story itself, I just really found Ruby so relatable on a number of different levels. Just first of all, her feelings of like insecurity at school, just in the sense of feeling like even though she's hearing, it's kind of like she grew up, like everyone knew her as the kid from the deaf family, and she had to go to speech therapy because she didn't grow up in a household where people were speaking English, so she kind of had to learn proper pronunciation and so on from speech therapy. And there's implication that there was some teasing as a result of that. And like obviously I didn't have that experience, but I think everyone can relate to this idea of feeling like an outsider for whatever it is about you, right? Everybody can relate to that insecurity, I think.
Mhm.
And so that element of it, she has friends, but we get the sense that it's not a lot of really close friends because she mostly, whenever she's not at school, she has to work on the fishing boat, which she doesn't seem to mind doing. But also, there's like some stuff that feels very teenage about how like even her mom certainly supports her working on the fishing boat and helping the family out in that regard, but also points out like, wait, you didn't change your clothes after working on the boat before going to school? That's not on us.
Yeah.
you know, you smell like fish, and people are going to make fun of you for smelling like fish, and that has nothing to do with the family you come from. Like, because there's lots of other fishing families in the area.
Yeah, which I mean that, and just on those teenage moments, that's another very powerful part in the film, like
Mm-hmm.
where when she has decided that she's going to rebel, and she doesn't tell her family, right? Like she
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't go to work that
Yeah.
morning. Very teenage, like just narrow, like even as as
Yeah.
empathetic and thoughtful as she is, like it's
Mm-hmm.
just like, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm not going to work. And it happens to be the day that the boat inspector is joining their boat,
Right.
and they do not have a hearing person who can hear
And
the
the
alarms or the
regulations, and
radio.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
dad specifically says when they're having a conversation about it later, it's like, if we had known you weren't going to be there, we could have made an arrangement for somebody.
Right. But when they showed up that morning, they needed to go fish. Like they
Mm-hmm.
had to go get fish. And so they were already down the path of going to fish when the
Yeah.
inspector joins them. And it just sort of, they didn't think it through, but you can see why, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like it was their sort of their natural like evolution of their day.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, all right, well, this lady's coming with us, like let's just go fish, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not thinking about, well, Ruby's not here, we're in violation, but you don't. So it's like you said, like you want everybody to be happy. There's so many things in here where it's like, yes, somebody did something wrong, but it's like it's
Mm-hmm.
hard. It's really it's never like really points blame. Like,
Yeah.
yes, Ruby should have told them that she wasn't coming, and they could have
Mm-hmm.
made arrangements. They probably should have not gone out with the inspector when she got on board, knowing they didn't have the regulations there.
Right.
And the inspector didn't do anything wrong, but you kind of still feel like her and
Yeah.
the Coast Guard,
Well,
like there's sort of like a negative connotation of that.
yeah,
But
like I thought that's a really interesting example, because what I was just I don't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry,
no,
but I think overall, just kind of to echo what you're saying, I feel like one of the things that the movie does really well is that there are all of these different characters who have their own thoughts and feelings about everything, but we understand all of them. And so every time a character does something in the movie, we understand why. We understand the emotional logic behind what every character does at any moment. Right?
right.
There's no point in this movie where you're like, what? I don't understand why this character is acting like this. That doesn't make sense to me. Right? Like you always get it, and it's just a matter of everyone has their own kind of competing priorities and insecurities. But like
Well,
even
and they're not black and white either.
right,
Like the
yeah,
brother is a great example. Like the brother is determined to be a part of the fishing community to the point where he will go into a place where he can't communicate with anybody and
mm-hmm,
ends up getting into a fight
yeah,
over it, right? But then makes the best of it. But he also, you can understand his frustration with Ruby, and
mm-hmm,
it's he wants her to be successful, and he also resents her for being like the key that like where he can't be the one that takes care of things. Like they need her, or he is insignificant in the fishing community. He
mm-hmm,
hates that,
mm-hmm.
but you get like why he doesn't hate her.
Well, and he almost feels too that it's not even like that. He almost feels like, because it's always easy for people to default to saying, "Oh, we'll just talk through Ruby." He doesn't even get a chance to try to do it himself,
Right,
because everyone just says that'll be too hard. Have Ruby do it. They don't
right.
even really like give him the opportunity to try, and that's frustrating for him. And so, but like just to touch back to even this inspector, this fishing inspector, who's there to just make sure they're following all the regulations and everything, because part of the whole premise here is that there are quotas in the area to make sure that the fish in the area aren't overfished, but that the men, like the perspective of this fishing family that we're here, is that the broker that they're currently all selling through, they feel like we're not making any money because we can only sell this much, but that broker is eating up all of the profits from it. We're having to pay him such a huge cut that we don't make any money anymore.
And then on top of that, the cost of the inspections is placed on the fisherman,
Right.
not on the broker.
Yeah, and
Which,
so part of the plot is that they eventually later decide that they're going to try doing their own co-op instead of going through that broker, which is, it's a big scary thing, and especially because they're talking about starting a small business, the idea that they might have to lean even more heavily on Ruby, it makes sense, and she is also not like, it's not like she doesn't want to do it. It's just that she also wants to do something else that conflicts, and that's the problem. But but just to tie back to this young woman who's the inspector on this. So on the one hand, it would be easy to look at the way she handles that situation and say that she's maybe a little bit passive aggressive about it, right? That what she does is she just calls the Coast Guard without telling them anything, right? She doesn't try to tell them, I have to call the Coast Guard, I have to report you for this. She just calls the Coast Guard. And then, in fact, when the Coast Guard is coming up and, like, blasting the siren and talking to them over the megaphone, which of course they can't hear, and they end up having to like bump up against the boat and jump on and scare everybody because they can't get their attention. Whereas she's standing right there, she could have let them know. Right?
She's in her mind, she's like, I'm a passive observer.
Well,
so I don't get involved in what happens.
I don't even think it's that. I think there's an element of she's a young woman with two strangers she doesn't know, and she's in the point of saying, I am now legally obligated to shut down their livelihood.
That's actually, I hadn't thought of it from that perspective.
And maybe I want to have some backup before they receive that information.
Yeah.
And so, like, it occurred to me, like, after the fact, because there was a moment there where I was so there with, Frank and Leo, who are the father and the brother respectively, and, like, wanting, like, at the same time that like, it's the dilemma we're in as the watcher is at the same time that we feel like they're good at running their fishing boat, maybe they should be okay, but at the same time we also have to recognize, but they can't talk to people on the radio. They can't hear if the Coast Guard is trying to flag them down.
Right.
We can see why it's a safety regulation that there needs to be someone on the boat who can hear.
Right. And it can be unfair or whatever, but it's the reality. That is the process. Like, that's how it's set up. And you do need someone who can understand, who can hear those things, right? Like, it's just part of it.
Yeah. Or at least as things in the existing system function, like that's part of the dilemma. But
right. But that's the thing. Like, I'm sure, like, again, there are other industries or things where, like, as things evolve, like, could there be a place where can the radio nowadays, can it actually do, type form of what's coming over the radio? Mm-hmm. And could, when a radio thing or like, there's things it could sense, like, if the Coast Guard pulls an alarm that's at a certain frequency, can it start flashing lights, just like how their alarm clock is a flashing light as opposed to right? Like, there's things that could be done, but those don't exist yet, right? Not in this boat, right? And I don't know enough about it, whether it exists other places.
Well, and it's also the sort of thing where they haven't had to do that because Ruby's there.
It's also true. Like, even if those things exist and you could outfit your boat to do that, they've never had to do it, right?
Yeah. So I think that there's an element of, like, as the story develops, that's kind of part of, I think, the dad's change of heart, because on the one hand, we could imagine him being really angry that this all happens because she decided not to show up for work that day. But I think instead what we see from him is realizing, kind of for the first time, not only does she care about this that much, but also maybe we have been being really unfair, making her bear all of the weight of this. And there's just a really lovely scene with the two of them that I think is like that night where they go and sit out on the truck. And, like, I don't know if, like, holding her throat would have been a meaningful thing, but, like, just, I don't even know that it's about that as much as just him. He asks her to sing for him, right? And we know
the movie builds the credibility for that, whether it's a real thing or not, because of, like, what's earlier told, and that's why I said it buys you buys itself a lot of credibility, because the earlier joke, when he rolls up to the school to pick her up and he's just banging, like, gangster rap.
Yeah.
And at first you don't understand, like, why he's doing it. Like, oh, did it just accidentally turn on? And so she gets in, she's like, this is too loud, and turns it down. And then he gets angry. And he's like, why did you turn that down? Like, because he loves the bass of gangster
Yeah.
rap. So it's buying you the credibility that,
Mm-hmm.
again, whether or not it is truly transitional or not to the voice chord, but you
Right.
you're what the point is that we have been built to understand that he can appreciate music through the vibration and the
Mm-hmm.
feeling that it can give outside of what you hear.
Right.
Right. Like,
But
that's what
even
it's.
yeah, but
Yeah.
even beyond that piece of it, like it's almost not. I think necessarily about whether like he can't tell she's a good singer by feeling her throat, but what he does is he sees her singing and sees
Right.
her putting her heart into it,
Yes.
and that's it's such a lovely scene. And like tying back into that, like we haven't really talked about this side of the movie very much at all, but there's also the aspect of her always singing to herself, like to her Walkman or whatever, and being able to do so very unself-consciously when she's like out on the fishing boat or whatever, because it's like no one else there hears her, and so like it's just her own private little thing even when they're around. But then all of a sudden when she starts thinking, well, maybe I try choir at school, but then when she has to audition in front of the other students, she chokes, right? She can't bring herself to do it right away. And so there's the whole bit with the music teacher who I think at first is understanding that yes, this is a very common teenage thing that they are nervous about performing in front of their peers for the first time. I get it. And he tries to help her sort of calm down with that. But then when she actually is able to sing, there's a moment where he's like, oh, wow, she's untrained, but has a lot of real potential there. And so the storyline of her, you know, the recognition from the story of the idea that the talent is one thing, and maybe to become a really big success you do have to have some degree of you know innate talent, but that does not excuse you from having to do the work. Like to become successful at that sort of thing, that you need that talent and you need the work. It's not if you have the talent you don't need to do the work. And especially for her, because she has always just sung to herself whatever sounded good. She doesn't have like proper technique. She doesn't have experience with like, okay, it's one thing if you're just kind of singing to yourself under your breath. It's another thing if you want people to hear you in the back of the audience, right? And so the like all of that stuff, and him being kind of the other end of this tug of war that she's in, because he's saying, look, I think that you have enough potential that I am willing to donate to you a lot of my personal time to try to help you and train you for this. But that is enough of my personal time that I'm taking away from other things that I might do for free, that I need you to respect my time and not show up late and have me waiting on you, right? Like that. So from his
I
perspective, that like that idea of like him being entirely reasonable from that end too, right?
Yeah, I loved his character
Yeah.
because he could have so easily been the stereotypical like strict teacher, you know, and he's strict,
Mm-hmm.
but he's so empathetic and yet and like you said, reasonable. And they do such a great job of showing so many little things like the fact that, you know, it acknowledges that he has a wife and children.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's not just like some curmudgeony old music teacher. Like he is
Right.
a man with a full life that is
Yeah.
donating this time to her, and she is not respecting it. Like, and
Right.
that is
Yeah.
a fair thing to ask her. He reminds her that like her struggle is real, but she is not the only person who has ever struggled as
Right.
a child. Like that he was an immigrant and couldn't even speak English. So the fact that she could at least get some sounds out, you know, was
Mm-hmm.
like put her a leg up on him. And then it like, and but he didn't make it like a big deal. Like you shouldn't be care about that, but
Mm-hmm.
you can't martyr yourself on this, right? Like
Right.
it's if
Well.
you want to get past it, you have to understand that like everybody, it's that whole joke. Like every person that you meet is fighting a battle that you don't know about,
Mm-hmm.
and helping educate her to that in a way that is, yes, he's strict and he's driving, but he does it from a caring perspective, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and I thought he was a phenomenal character.
Yeah, I liked him a lot for sure, and just this element of like, from the idea of a creative standpoint of just saying, I think you have the potential to do this if you can put in the time, and you know what? Maybe you can't put in the time. And that does not make you a bad person, but if you want to do this, I will help you, but you have to be willing to put in as much as I am, right? I don't want to feel like I'm dragging you along and I'm the one making you take singing lessons. That's not what's happening here. I am offering to help you if you want it, but don't tell me you want it and then don't show up. And I thought that's great. And then of course that ties into, because there's the boy that what Miles I think was the
Yeah.
yeah. So where there's some initial, like, we can imagine some flirtation there, but he's also friends with some of the other students that have teased her, and so there's a question of like, well, where's he really coming from? But he's also in choir, and they get assigned to do a duet together. And there's just the normal sort of teenage awkwardness of trying to figure that out. But then there's also another very ordinary teenage sort of betrayal where when her parents find out that he's been practicing singing in her room, they want to have a conversation with him, and they're very sort of explicit in their descriptions of what they want to recommend in terms of safe sex and all of that, which Ruby's having to try to translate or refusing to do so, as the case might be. And it is a very bizarre, surreal conversation for him, and he makes a very poor but very normal sort of teenage decision that he tells one of his friends about this really weird conversation he had. The friend doesn't see how there's discretion needed and tells a bunch more people, and then all of a sudden it's all over school, and it has become, a lapse in judgment has become a rather profound betrayal, right?
Yes.
And so there's, but again, it's like it all feels like very relatable, ordinary teenage behavior that is well told in an interesting story, and we feel for the characters. Once again, it's like every character is making decisions based on emotional logic that we can follow. They're all well drawn in that regard.
Yes. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's my favorite movie of the year. So
It's great. Okay, so do we want to go ahead and move on now to West Side Story?
yeah, because I think I don't want to be trite in covering it, but I mean, we don't have to dive too much into like the plot details and the
Right,
fact that
yeah, it's like, what is this
this
movie? Well, it's West Side Story again.
Yeah, and more of what does this version bring and what's interesting about it.
Yeah.
Yes, I think let's knock that out. So.
Okay, so what did you think about it? I mean, you kind of just started a preliminary there, but
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. It was. I mean, it's obviously the West Side Story. It's the same story. It's just, and I found myself a couple of times asking the question that you have presented with some of the Disney movies of as like, did this need to be retold? Especially since it's not even, they didn't even like evolve it to a new time, right? Like it's literally takes place in the same time period. It's the same story. I there may be deviations. I didn't read
yeah,
that
I
much
mean,
into it.
there were some changes, but they're mostly pretty minor. It's just shuffling things around.
Yeah, I didn't even. They weren't enough for me to be like, wait, that didn't happen in the
Well, like
line.
for example, "Play It Cool Boy" is like the context of the song is pretty different. So in this version, we have Tony going to Riff and trying to basically tell them like, don't bring weapons to this thing. Let's try to stop the rumble if he can. Try to calm things down, and it doesn't go very well. But in the original movie, that song was after Riff is killed. It is the rest of the gang trying to plan their next move and not just fly off the handle.
Yeah. See, this is all stuff that like it is so subtle that without actually looking it up, I didn't remember any of it.
Mm-hmm.
So the broad strokes are all there. The songs are all there. Um, it. So I'm unsure where I landed because I think it's a well done. It, it's maybe different in those Disney movies in that maybe this does introduce this story at a time where this story may be relevant again to a new audience. Whereas maybe those Disney movies aren't doing that. Like it's not like people didn't aren't
Well,
still
like
watching Beauty and the Beast,
the,
right?
the
Like
the criticism that I've often had of those live action Disney remakes is that I find myself while watching them saying, this seems well made enough, but there's no point watching it that I don't wish that I was watching the other version, right?
right.
It just
And
feels,
I didn't enter that with this movie.
yeah.
I because I think I was putting myself more in the well, because this is now coming out and that's a lesser not it's not lesser known to us and to people who watch movies, but maybe the people that this movie could resonate with aren't aren't going to go back and watch the original West Side Story. And I think that some of the things, at least again, without I didn't research it enough, which is whatever. I mean, this isn't that in depth of a podcast. I felt that it treated some of the more like deep scenes, like some of the ones that were more like important. I felt it gave them more emotional weight than the original one did. Like I felt like it played the spectrum a little wider
Mm-hmm.
in that it wasn't all just like this musical thing. Like, yes, you go into the musical numbers, but when you come back to like, and maybe that's just the nature of it being a more modern movie versus what movies looked like in the 70s. But I felt like those important scenes carried more importance in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not mad that it's made. Like I enjoyed my time watching it. I think the talent was great. Um, I it wasn't a waste of time, I guess, is what
Yeah.
I went to. But is it the best movie of the year compared to these things that are original ideas or new ideas or tell us something new? No,
Yeah.
it's not.
It was honestly not even my favorite musical of the year. And I don't even mean the animated ones. I liked In the Heights more, and I liked Tick Tick Boom more.
I haven't seen Tick Tick Boom, but I liked In the Heights more as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, in Kanto, I liked way more than this. But it's fine that it exists. Um, yeah, that's. I mean, I have
Yeah.
some nuanced things to say about some things that were interesting about it, but are less of the big picture of the
Right.
movie. Yeah.
Like, I thought tonally, like, a lot of, I think what you may have been reacting to there is that in a lot of respects, by grounding everything in a more realistic setting, like in the original, there's a lot of, what sometimes we call staginess, where it sort of feels like we're watching a Broadway set,
Yes,
right?
yeah, that you've articulated what I was trying to in a much
Yeah.
better way.
Well,
Yeah.
so I've had more time to think about it. But in setting it in more realistic settings, and I think some of the structural changes do make the story feel a little bit more grounded. But like what I was saying when I talked about it before is that in some ways, though, for me, it made it feel all the stranger when they would suddenly burst into song. Because it's one thing when it feels like I'm watching a Broadway musical on a set. It's like I expect them to burst into song, but when they're not, I'm almost like surprised, or it feels more strange when they're doing it. But
So my wife actually had the opposite reaction.
okay,
Like
interesting.
she feels almost like disassociated with some of these things where it's all songs, right?
Mm,
And unless they deliver at a very high level, like a Hamilton,
mm-hmm,
like Hamilton, she loves, but like Wicked, she didn't really enjoy that much.
mm,
Les Mis didn't enjoy that much because like there's like this sort of disassociation when it's always like the song part. She actually enjoyed the fluctuation back and forth
mm-hmm,
where the songs were a part of the movie, but they weren't the whole movie,
Okay.
right? And so I'm not saying one's right or wrong.
Right.
It's just I just present a different point
Yeah,
of
no,
view.
I feel like that's not exactly kind of what I was trying to get at, but no, I mean that's an interesting point though. I think that the balance in this is pretty good in terms of like how much talking versus how much singing and that sort of. But
I definitely understand what you're saying. I'm just
yeah,
I that is a different perspective of by grounding it and
it
making the song seem odd actually felt better for her, right?
well fair. Like I think ultimately what I was trying to get at is that it made the transitions feel strange to me.
Mhm.
Like the moment of going to song felt different. Like the transition felt jerkier to me. But
Oh yeah, I
there's
agree with you.
actually, by and large, I like a lot of the changes that they made to the story. Most of which are, a lot of which are pretty subtle, and by and large, they are integrated so much that I think, like you, a lot of people probably just don't even notice, and they would have to go and actually rewatch the original to remember. Oh wait, yeah, that wasn't like that before. Like
Yeah,
for example, Rita Moreno's character, like obviously she's a cast member from the original playing a different role here, but like that character was not in the original. She took the place of Pops. Like so her husband, who is not around in this version, was the actual guy who played that role in the original, right? Her character didn't exist in the original. So it's like, things like that. So a lot of those changes I think are pretty interesting. But there's also a handful of places where I really feel like the emotion sort of turns on a dime that feels weird in this context. Like, for example, there's the bit early on where Riff has gone to Tony to say, "Hey, I need you to back me up at the dance tonight. We're going to like confront this other gang. I need you to back me up." And Tony's saying, "Look, I can't do it. I'm just out of jail. I can't get in trouble again. I'm trying to do something different with my life. So I can't back you up, my best friend that I grew up with, even though this scene comes across as a profound betrayal to you. I can't do it." And then immediately after that scene, he starts singing about tonight, something special is coming. And I'm like, what? Where did that come from? That's a bizarre emotional
yeah,
transition. Um, but and then the other one is the original has an Act One to Act Two intermission. So there's the Rumble where Riff and Bernardo are killed, and then there's an intermission, and then we come back. Um, Without that intermission, we go straight from Riff and Bernardo are dead to I feel pretty, oh so pretty, and it's like it just makes her song feel just extra doomed without having that break in between.
yeah. And I actually that part I did feel, and I wondered if that was on purpose, right? Like,
I think it was deliberate, but I'm not sure that it was effective. You
it's
know what I
fair.
mean? Like I don't like I think that they decided to lean into it, but I think in some ways the story wasn't really written to do that. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
when you see a musical like as a musical or for even in a movie version where there's that intermission, you have the sort of act one climax, the big action, and then there's a moment where you relax. You go and think about something else. Maybe you go use the bathroom or something, or you just listen to the music and you're relaxed. And then when you start back up, even though you remember,
sorry.
it's okay. Even though you
Yeah,
remember what happened, and so you still have intellectually the knowledge of, oh gosh, she doesn't know what has happened. You're still there in that moment with her, whereas in the movie version, without that gap, you just go right from one to the other. So you're still heightened and stressed, keyed up about the violence, right into that song. And it feels very different. And I think, like I said, that it seems like they understood that that was happening and decided to lean into it. And I'm not sure I agree with that creative decision.
yeah. I think that's a good description of it because It's hard for me to comment on exactly it too, because we watched the movie in two parts. Not, we didn't break it there.
Hmm.
So we watched it two nights. We watched up until they were getting ready to go to the Rumble, and then we stopped it and then
Hmm.
watched it the next night. So we had already sort of given ourselves this intermission, which doesn't exactly accomplish what you're talking about, because it
Hmm.
was still an abrupt transition.
Hmm.
But it's still, it makes it harder for me to weigh in on what would it feel like to watch the movie straight through,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I'm paying extra attention to some of these sorts of things just because, like, I'm not trying to make this like a brag or something, but like I've taken some classes on like musical improv. But the reason I mention it is just because a big part of that, in order to try to do an improv version of a musical, is to understand the archetypes of musical structure so that you can try to recreate that, right? And so, just in terms of the ebb
mhm.
and flow of a typical musical and sort of the expectations, the tropes, so to speak, of what does a musical feel like so that you can play with that, right? Because it, on the one hand, it doesn't mean you're locked into a rigid structure, but it means that if you're going to deviate from that structure, you should be doing so with intention and understand why, right? As
Yep.
opposed to just like you're doing whatever and it just feels like it's not like a musical, right? Like even if you have songs, it's not going to feel like the Broadway musical feel, right? And so in this case, this pacing of rising up to the Act One climax, and then everything's different, but you have a break in between where when you come back, you're back at the low energy and you have to build that up again. But by design, right? Like so, the story is designed with that ebb and flow in mind, that without the intermission feels abrupt.
No, that makes sense. So
Yeah. So in any case, though, I think we're largely on the same page, which is that it does a lot of things pretty well. Like it's certainly well made, but it just and like even when I was comparing it to the live action Disney things before, like I agreed and I said so when I first saw it that this movie version felt like it justified its existence to me in the sense of
yes.
like I get why this version of the story is different enough that it like I can understand it being made, but at the same time, another discussion I overheard or read about was talking about how in some ways it feels almost kind of like Spielberg doing a victory lap. Like, why is this the movie that Spielberg felt like he wanted to make right now? Like, like he's one of the big names that everyone's just kind of like it's almost a guarantee that whatever movie he makes is going to be great. But so, like, why is he taking and going back and remaking old things now? Um, and then there's just this expectation that like we should reward anything he does because he does anything he tries competently. You know, we can say his skills as a filmmaker are still on display, but we can also question what his choices.
Yeah, I thought about that a little bit too, and I just wonder if it's the sort of the immigrant versus nationalist thing that he's trying
Hmm.
to weigh in on. That was where I kind of landed.
Yeah.
Is
Well, like it's certainly true that one of the things that you can absolutely criticize the original for is putting a lot of white actresses in brown makeup to play
yeah,
Puerto Ricans,
yes,
which is not great. And certainly, like, it's one thing where, like, at the time it was more common, but we can certainly say it's better in this one where they don't do that. They cast actual Puerto Rican actors and other actors of Central American and South American descent as those roles instead. Also, one like note that I think is interesting more than I think it's necessarily 100% successful is that there is a character in the original who is kind of a tomboy and she's trying to be one of the gang, and they keep kind of dismissing her because she's a girl. Whereas in this, they like explicitly make that character a trans man, like someone who's saying, "No, I am a man,"
Yeah.
but not necessarily being fully accepted in that way that they want. Um, that I think it's interesting to make that subtext into text, but the movie doesn't really seem like it has anything it wants to do or say about that, though. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
So,
And so,
like,
well, and so, yeah, that kind of leads into kind of like the overall feeling of like, okay, why did he make this? Like, he wanted to put some of these things that are relevant nowadays, like
mm-hmm,
that the trans community is now more front and center than it has been in a long time. The immigrant situation is different versus the nationalist, like, we've been here established thing.
mm-hmm,
But what the movie doesn't do, and maybe this is just a fault of me seeing it in the same time as Belfast and really respecting how Belfast takes a situation and extrapolates it across multiple things, it doesn't feel relevant to what we're actually talking about today
yeah,
in the way that maybe he meant it, he thought it was going to.
hmm,
It talks about those things, but it doesn't let you draw like,
yeah.
here's why this matters now, right?
Right, like that makes me think a little bit of some of what we've said about Don't Look Up, which is the idea that, like, in theory, supposedly it's a satire on the way society is handling climate change, but the scenario described in the film isn't really very much like that.
Right.
It's a very different sort of situation,
Yeah.
in ways that matter to the satire, and that's kind of a problem. And so, on the one hand, the racial tensions in this movie, like, certainly, racial tensions have not gone away. That continues to be a problem. But also, the specific ways that they're expressed in this movie don't necessarily feel like they map super well to today's America.
Correct.
I mean, again, this is something where, like, there might be a lot of people who disagree with that, because that's certainly
Yeah.
subjective. But I tend to agree that it doesn't feel like a story that's just as timeless now as it was then. It feels like a movie that was made at that time, and now this is a movie that has remade the movie that was made at that time.
Yes, I agree. So the last question I have for you, which, because this was a point
Okay.
of discussion, and I don't, there's kind of a two-part question to this.
Okay.
So was the overusage of, for lack of like a better term, Spanglish in this movie, where the Puerto Rican actors and actresses flow back and forth between Spanish and English
Mm-hmm.
very frequently with no subtitles, was that distracting or confusing to you? And did it, and second part of the question is, do you think that served any kind of purpose to the movie?
I
Because if
mean,
for me, like, I'll just get into the background, like, and you know this, but maybe everybody doesn't know this, but hopefully they do based on the rest of the conversation. But like, it doesn't matter to me. Like, I speak Spanish, so like, for me watching the movie, like, my brain flips back and forth like correctly.
mm-hmm,
But my wife is watching it and she kept asking me, she's like, what did they say? What did they say? What did they say? So
mm-hmm,
it became very distracting to me because I had to keep translating what they kept saying.
right.
And then so it made me wonder, like, okay, if you didn't have somebody who could translate it for you, does it take away from the movie? And what was there a point? Right. So sorry.
Well, so, like, I felt like there were certainly times where I wasn't sure specifically what they're saying, right? Because they're speaking in Spanish without subtitles, and so, like, I took Spanish in high school. I know it a little bit. I certainly am not fluent in any regard. I can pick up, words here and there, like, and sometimes I can get a little bit from context in ways that, like, someone who hasn't taken it at all might not. I'm not trying to take any credit there. I'm basically saying, yes, there were definitely parts where I'm like, I don't necessarily understand the specifics of the dialogue here, but it didn't really bother me. Like, it felt certainly like they're doing this more than most Hollywood movies do. Um, I don't mind, though, just because I sort of feel like it felt kind of authentic to me. just because, in my interactions with some people who do kind of switch back and forth, like, I mean, it's not a lot of people. It's not. I'm not trying to say that, but the point just being, I kind of believed it. It felt
Oh,
believable
it's
to
it's.
me.
I'll
Uh,
tell you, it's 100% genuine. Like
right. Yeah.
it's not
I suspected that was the case, and so basically, I felt like I was getting enough of it that it didn't really matter what I was missing, because you can kind of get a lot of it just from context clues.
right. So I guess to add some depth to my second question
Hmm.
is, what do you feel like it was in the movie because it makes it more authentic, which is accurate,
Mm.
or do you think it was in the movie because this was a question I heard from somebody else, not my wife, but somebody
Okay.
else I talked to this movie about. Do you think it was in the movie because it was trying to make a point that because Spanish is becoming so prevalent that maybe it's almost like saying maybe you should know this? Like, did it feel
I
like
no,
it was like
I
pressuring
didn't
it on you?
I didn't
Okay,
I did not get that impression at all. It really
good.
felt more to me like there was a deliberate and conscious intention of the filmmakers to say, one of the criticisms of the original is that there were a lot of people that the movie was supposedly depicting that felt like they're not seeing themselves on screen. And the intent here was, we want this to feel more like, for, you know, people, from whether it's Puerto Rico or other, other South American, Central American countries, or just, immigrants from anywhere. Like, if the idea here is that we're trying to tell a story that relates to people with that background, we want them to feel seen and to be able to see themselves on screen. And that often ties very much into how do they communicate. And I think also depicting that in an authentic way is reasonable for others too. Like, I don't think that there's an expectation that the audience should be able to understand every word, but perhaps an expectation that we should try to be okay with it not being a problem that we
That
don't
yeah, I
understand
like
every word.
that's great. Yeah. And that's exactly why I asked it, because the only thing that it's not inauthentic about it. The only thing the context shifting that they do is 100% authentic. The reality is that they speak English in situations in the movie where they wouldn't be speaking English to each other
Mm-hmm.
because they need it for the plot to go on. And then they shift into Spanish a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some of those situations, they would have only been speaking in Spanish to each other.
I'm sure that there was a lot of very deliberate intent in the screenwriters in the screenplay to try to say, we want to show as much of that as we can without people who can't speak Spanish really getting lost.
Right. And that's where obviously it was deliberate. And that's why it was an interesting thing to discuss as sort of our final point on the movie, because had they actually made it truly authentic, and this is where these people speak Spanish and this is where these people speak English, you
Mm-hmm.
would have had to subtitle it
Right.
because you wouldn't have gotten the context. But the way that they flow is
Mm-hmm.
natural and authentic. And yet I felt like, but again, then that's why I have a different perspective, because I sit in those situations. Like every time I go to Miami, like that's what my life is like, is like I did that's how people talk, they speak in English for a while and then they get excited about something and it all shifts to Spanish like that,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no context shift. It one goes into the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and so I was very good about it. But the fact that, like, again, Abby kept asking me, like, well, what are they saying? What are they saying? But she's generally like, if I hadn't have been there, and that's why I asked you, like, if I hadn't have
Mm-hmm.
been there, would she have just been able to enjoy the movie and just said,
I,
okay,
I, I
what they do?
suspect
Yeah.
that it's possible that that might be, because it's one of those things where
They didn't
there
say
was,
anything critical. I'll tell you that.
well,
There wasn't like some friggin' like secret plot development
yeah,
that happened in the Spanish part. Yeah.
I assumed, I think that one of the things that, like, there were certainly times where it's like, I wondered what specifically they were saying, but I didn't have someone that I could just say, hey, what did they just say? And so that possibility didn't cross my mind. And so I just rolled with it. But it is possible, I could imagine, especially because they are doing it differently than most movies do. Probably largely because even though I think a lot more people these days are used to scenes taking place in some other language with subtitles. But I can imagine with this thing that they're trying to do of showing the authentic switching back and forth, it would probably seem strange to have the subtitles. Like, do you only show them up on the Spanish words? That doesn't make sense. Do you show it for everything? That feels weird too. Like, that makes it sound like you are having to put subtitles up there for, like people can't understand their accents or something like that, so they need subtitles. That could read badly. You know what I mean? Um, so I can see that that's a little bit tricky, but I feel like they handled it pretty well, and I think it might have just been kind of an unfortunate quirk to get into the rhythm of, like to just be able to trust that the movie's not going to lose you if you don't know what every single line means.
Yeah, no, yeah, and that answers my question. So,
Okay.
because again, it was odd for me because
Hmm.
it's very deliberate about it because it ramps it up, right?
Hmm.
Like it starts out very like, oh, hey, every once in a while we're going to throw a Spanish phrase in,
Yeah.
and then it gets to like we're going to have a conversation about something, and then we're going to continue our conversation when we get heated
Hmm.
in Spanish,
Well, so
right?
I noticed what is kind of almost it's a cliche for these types of situations, though, in movies, which is, no, we should speak English. We're practicing our English. That is why this scene that almost certainly would have been in Spanish will be in English for the benefit of the audience because we're practicing our English. And again, I'm not criticizing, I'm just amused because that is so often the reason used for doing that in movies where this comes up. Um, but in any case, yeah. So I think that like that element of the movie is good. I like that it wanting that to be a more authentic depiction, and again, like even using the word authentic can sometimes be a little bit of a minefield because of course there's lots of different ways
Right.
to
And
like
that's like I
it's
said,
like there's not any one like this. I see this come up with like discussions of recipes, right? Like like authentic Chinese food. It's like, okay, well there's lots of different kinds of Chinese food, and it's not like there's one way that's the only real way and everything else is fake somehow, right? Like it's there's lots of diversity of human experience, but I like that there's an intent.
human beings are involved, so
Yeah.
it's like when they choose to shift into Spanish versus English, if you're in reality, like that context shift, it could be because of emotion, it could be
Mm-hmm.
because of the situation, it could be there's so many reasons why people shift back and forth who are
Mm-hmm.
truly bilingual. And and so to say this movie is it's authentic in how quickly they do it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's authentic and like whether that's exactly how people when they choose to speak English and when they choose to speak Spanish, that part's like a little
Yeah.
you know?
But yeah, so I liked that aspect of it honestly, even though it meant that there were some lines that I didn't know what specifically they were saying. But again, I think that the screenplay was carefully written with that in mind, so that none of those lines are crucial to understanding the plot.
Yeah, that's what I said. I can tell you right now, there was nothing I translated during that movie where it was like make or break, like you
Yeah,
didn't get the movie. Yeah.
yeah.
But
But
anyway, so
anyway,
but I thought that was sort of my last point. Like I thought that was interesting. I thought that was obviously it was deliberate.
mm-hmm.
So
All
um
right. Well, so
we go into the Oscars.
Yep, and I think I'm pleased that we kind of both ended up on CODA as kind of our personal favorite. Although it's one of those things too that I was thinking about, like the overall list of Oscars, and I was also just thinking about how there were several other movies this year that I liked more than most of the movies on the Best Picture nominee list that didn't get nominated at all.
Give
Um,
me just one. What?
Pig, The Green Knight,
Okay.
um, Last Night in Soho, I really liked. and didn't get
Oh,
nominated for
yeah, I
anything.
want to see that. I can't wait to see that. I
Yeah.
haven't watched it yet.
I mean, I think that Last Night in Soho is not perfect. I think there are some things that like don't work as well as they're trying to do, but so much of what it does is so cool. Um, and so I just like there was, and for that matter, Spider-Man: No Way Home is great. And even I feel like that is a movie that could even win over some like non-MCU fans, and like certainly for you who like Spider-Man in general. I think it's great. So it's I'm not trying to diminish the movies here so much as it just feels like, although I really like Coda, it's not a year where I feel especially passionate that there's one particular movie this should definitely win. It's more like like I like these they're really good, but like is it the best? I don't know.
It was the movie I enjoyed spending my time watching the most.
Fair enough.
So, all right,
But we'll see who the trophy goes to on Sunday. But in the
Sunday.
meantime, there's a few more days left, so everyone got time still to watch a couple more movies, and we'll come back with another update after the awards. Not like right after, but once we know them.
Yep.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.